hold on. We have to go back. People couldn't join. Now everybody's joining. Sorry for that. Now I have to live through this again. I think everybody's in now. Perfect. Okay, let's get started again. Sorry for that. Sorry for the slight delay, and welcome to our webinar on AI and strategic sourcing. Thank you for making the time today to hear us out about what we believe AI can do for strategic procurement and especially strategic sourcing. It's an area that we have recently not heard an awful lot about because the conversations usually go to operational or tactical procurement. And if you have joined us previously, so you know what people are doing in that space. But today we really wanted to pivot into strategic procurement and talk about what AI can do there in order to help you make better decisions. Sourcing in general is probably something that doesn't require an awful lot of introduction. We will nevertheless do a quick review of what it is, what it should be, so that we are all on the same page before we then go into the digitalization of sourcing and how that happened over time, before we then actually have a look at what Procure AI is doing in that space now. So before we jump in, let's do a quick round of introductions. My name is Fabian Lampe. I'm the founder of Advanced Procurement, a small boutique consultancy specialized on digital procurement, operating model design, savings programs, topics like that. And I have with me Oscar and Konstantin. Oscar, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes. So hi, everyone. My name is Oscar Valdini. I'm a director of operations at Procure AI, and I work a lot on our strategic sourcing product, both with prospective customers and our existing customers.
Perfect. Konstantin.
Yes, also warm welcome from my side. I'm Konstantin. I'm one of the co-founders of Procure AI. I work at Procure on everything that's go-to-market and operations related. Maybe a few words, essentially what we do at Procure AI. I think that also makes just sense as a quick intro. So we are an AI native procurement automation platform. I think we are out of the typical startup size at this point. We are more than 60, we are close to 60 people now. Have been in 6 years, based out of London, Paris, and Berlin as like our core hubs. And essentially, the core idea that makes us different is that we don't just ask you to rip out pieces out of your SAP, your Ariba, or your Coupa, but essentially run a layer of AI agents on top of these systems, and really make sure we build a connected and secure AI native procurement automation platform that exploits the data and makes sure that you buy in a much simpler way. So today we have more than 40 agents running across our platform, across the procurement, the different procurement processes from plan to strategy, source to contract, and purchase to pay. We are here that you don't just do work in procurement, but really use agents to really execute and elevate the work that you're doing, making sure that you focus on the work that's really value creating for you. I'm not going to go in each detail of these different agents. I think you have probably seen this overview as well. So I think I will stop.
But despite not going into a lot of detail, maybe you can just give a little bit of an overview of what are we looking at and what do we believe or what are we actually seeing here?
Yes. So I think what you basically see is a map of where we at Procure AI are today, right? This is like the agents that run on our platform. Let me basically frame what it actually means. What does an agent mean? Because the word is obviously overused these days, right? So an agent essentially does three things for us. It does puts basically three things together. That's memory, so it remembers inputs and outputs across tasks and changing conditions. A model that breaks a problem into different parts and decides what to do, and system access, which is probably one of the most important pieces. So it can actually retrieve and write information in your ERP, in your e-procurement, without essentially an additional need from a human essentially to interact. So when we look now at this overall of this landscape, you see agents that run in plan to strategy, right, where it's it's about category management, where it's about performance management, it's like a lot about like spend analytics. And then if you look in the middle, where you talk about source to contract, but today we will spend quite a bit of time on, we're talking about really the sourcing process from tactical or operational, tactical and strategic sourcing. And then you also have the supplier relationship management piece. Not going to spend that much time on that today, a tiny bit. And contract management. And then on the last bit in purchase to pay, where it's really, as Fabian already mentioned, like a lot of the talk about AI in procurement is today about, it's like where it's not about intake management. So someone wants to buy something and basically an agent helping you to define what you're buying and basically routing you into the right buying channel. I think if you have attended a webinar with us before, we actually spend quite a bit of time on that as well. So if you're interested, like just contact us. We're happy to like share some demos that we did in the past and some content on this. And then obviously in the operational piece where it's about order confirmations, two-way matches, and so on and so forth. So we with our platform can help you along this entire value chain of procurement. But today, to make it a bit simpler, because we don't have that much time, essentially we're looking at these 12 little boxes here in more detail today, right? And at the beginning, we'll run you a bit through like more the theoretical stuff of sourcing, I would say,
Yeah.
which is very important to create the context and also to explain why we have built this new module of ProcureAI.
Yeah,
And
just before you go there, because that's one of the things that I would like you to really explain of why are we doing this. And I made that comment earlier that usually we talk more about this operational thing, and I have done this now a couple times where in group audiences I asked, so what are the most prominent or most interesting use cases to you, and I've never heard sourcing. I've heard tail spend kind of automation. I've heard supplier onboarding, contract drafting, or like redlining stuff in that space, and then obviously all of the P2P automation. But nobody really ever talks about sourcing and especially strategic sourcing or the broader strategic procurement work. And that's why we wanted to really bring that topic back up, because that is also an area where AI has a massive opportunity to actually help us become faster and make more informed decisions. And that's why we wanted to really focus on that. We will quickly talk about later on like the different types and the different complexities of sourcing as part of that theoretical intro, but that's really why we wanted to have this conversation at this level of detail. But with that being said, that it's not something where everybody is immediately shouting, yeah, we want to hear about that. What is the reason that you actually decided to build a strategic sourcing capability now after having focused so much on the more pure automation related option or like agents, let's say?
So I think there's two ways of looking at this. I think the first one is really we originally started out with doing a lot of analytics work that's pre-LLM, then quickly moved into building an autonomous sourcing and negotiation engine that really covers the tail spend and the tactical spend, right? So that's where what we did for a long time, and that's where we were the platform, like that's really was the core of what we do, right? And that's where we then added intake management because obviously that feeds into that, making sure you can execute actually more and more of those purchase requests in an autonomous fashion. And as we moved along and we were able to basically cover more and more of the spend in the tail and the tactical area for our clients, we then looked at some point in more detail with some of our clients into the strategic spend. Like, what are they doing there? What's the work that needs to be done there? And we saw that there's a lot of opportunity. For us, it was very logical to take that step up as we want to make sure that you don't need an extra solution for your strategic spend, but you can basically run this from one platform. And if you think about it, if you walk through the sourcing flow, there is an agent or an AI step at almost every stage, right? You're structuring requirements from free text, like you're drafting tender documents, you're scouting suppliers, you're setting up an event, you're importing or normalizing price sheets, you validate your supplier responses. So there could potentially be a bit that you can actually do with an agent, every single piece of it. And I think we decided to build a dedicated model because the AI conversation, as you pointed out, Fabian, in procurement almost always stops at tailspin and tactical buying. But the strategic part, essentially where a lot of the value sits, and where actually not that much time, the AI community hasn't spent much time on this yet. And to be honest, most of it still runs at some point in the process that I just went through in Excel or PowerPoint. So if you look at our augmented strategic sourcing module, it's built around this complexity, right, that you have in strategic sourcing, the multidimensional pricing, round events, scenario analysis, making sure that's not just like applicable for certain categories, but like a broad range of categories. So the AI doesn't just do the drafting of the documents, but essentially can really help you at every step along that way. So you can think of it as an execution layer and not just another RFX tool.
And that's quite interesting because I mean, like this technology per se has been around for I don't know 20 years, almost 20 years, and so therefore there's a couple of solutions that have already tackled that, and I think like because I know some of them very very intimately, like they're not easy. When it comes to complex sourcing, the solutions become complex as well. And that is something that is obviously not very helpful for adoption because even things that I perceive as simple for a lot of people are difficult when it comes to procurement tools. And so therefore I think it's really interesting that you now got onto this, not only from this complexity perspective, which was theoretically solved, but also from this angle of, okay, how can we bring this agentic element and this automation element into the discussion? So, Oscar, I think that's where we will come to you in a little bit. Give me a couple of minutes in order to set the stage for that and talk a little bit more about what sourcing in procurement actually is. And again, I promise you it will not be boring. It will not be like, oh, I will not teach anything or try to be overly lengthy in it, but it's just important to really have the separation. And you will see why in a moment. Again, this slide is just in order to separate the two ideas of standard sourcing and strategic sourcing. We call it AI and strategic sourcing for a reason, because that's a longer process. Not to be confused with category management or category strategy development. That's another topic altogether, but a lot of you know strategic sourcing as a concept, a 7-step sourcing approach. And that is something different to what we do most of the time. Most of the time we do standard sourcing. Somebody comes to us with a requirement. We may or may not do an RFI. We may or may not do an RFP if it's a little bit unclear what that person actually is looking for or is open to explore different alternatives. And then we go to the RFQ and ask for the price before we end up negotiating. So I would say that's the standard classical part of sourcing that we see day in and day out. And that can be on very low value transactions of a couple of thousand. That can be on something that is mid-size of 100 or a couple 100,000. And it can be on this very extreme size of multiple million, up to hundreds of millions, so depending on your category. And that's where the strategic part comes in, and I'm not gonna go through all of it, but basically what it adds, because the standard part is still what we see in this RFX space, but the part before that, the strategizing, the market review, the internal analysis is obviously a lot more important when it comes to these bigger tenders. And I just highlighted a couple of points here. This is an abridged slide and not complete anyway, but just these highlighted points I think are extremely important when we start talking about strategic sourcing and some of the capabilities that we will hear about today. The first one is around business requirements and constraints, and that is something that is extremely important down the road, because very often we have a business that says, I want this, and I don't want it to be this way or that way. And so this is where it starts. This early in the process, we have an opportunity to collect that information when we do strategic sourcing in order to build that into our RFX down the road. And I think that is, out of 15 years of doing sourcing now, my biggest observation, that we very rarely talk about these kind of limitations and specific requirements enough at the beginning of the process, but rather rush to the market, ask for something, and then realize like when we start to analyze it or when we try to negotiate something, that there's a lot of elements that are moving pieces sometimes that are either hard coded into the decision or appear at least hard coded. And so it's this early that that starts, and that has been my biggest revelation when I started to work with some of these more advanced tools, that by knowing this earlier, I can make the analysis downstream a lot smoother. And that's why I also put in bold the second part under strategizing, where it's really about decision criteria and weighting, giving a price tag potentially to that, so that we can actually make things comparable that might not be perfectly comparable in itself. That we actually understand clearly upfront before we rush to the market, what is the desired outcome? What does good look like? What is the ideal kind of scenario of us getting out of or like awarding this project? And then also to think about strategic options. And I think this idea of scenario-based thinking is something that has kind of a revival since 12 months ago or so. And I believe this is exactly where this comes from. Like, strategic options means like there's different paths to a certain outcome. And that's what, understanding that is the part that is strategic about strategic sourcing. That we actually explore not just one route, but multiple routes. And I think this is what will stay with us now throughout the rest of this webinar. That this is really the couple of pieces that make our life a lot easier and get supported by tech if we actually understand that that's what we can do with it. Why am I saying that, and why am I trying to separate those two things? Because actually in the market we see that there's 3 different types of events that are usually discussed and compared. The super complex one, as I said before, multi-million, the in-between stuff, and then the tail, the small stuff. And it's a typical 80-20 between where we spend or where we see the events and where we see actually the value of those or the spend of these events. And I did a couple of projects where I analyzed the number of sourcing events at large scale companies, and we roughly see that the super complex stuff is less than 5% of all of the events a company runs in the year, but it represents roughly 65% of the total spend. So it's these massive ones that actually make a big difference. The strategic and tactical stuff that builds on top of that is somewhere around 15%, both in terms of volume, but also in terms of the value. So if you as a company run 200 events a year, that means that only 10 are super big, and only 30 roughly are where you get now to this 80% of your total spend. So 20% of those, so only these 40 events, are representing 80% of your spend. And then you have a bunch of these small ones that are in the tail that can still be significant, but will obviously not accumulate too much in terms of the spend that is impacted. But you as a team, if you get dragged into that, obviously spend a lot of time with that. And that's why the tech actually is built around that now. And we will get to that in just one second. But one final point on this complexity element is, what are the actual complexity drivers? Because very often, like, we talk about 3 bids and a buy, price is everything that is decided. I know that's obviously not true for the majority of cases, and people are immediately like, oh my goodness, like, why are we still talking just about price? No, it's not. Konstantin talked about ESG risk elements, supply chain disruptions. There's a billion things that we now need to consider that we haven't thought about 20 years ago, not as much necessarily. And that's driving up this complexity. And if you then add to that a complex product that needs to be broken down into multiple line items or in multiple lots, you have a supply market that is very big, and there's multiple people that you can invite to bid on that. And it's, for example, a global project. That is really where this complexity is coming from, and where very many people have said to me throughout consulting engagements, but also when I worked in companies, I cannot use the tool. The tool is not allowing me to replicate the complexity that I see and that I need to analyze in a Ariba sourcing, for example. just to give one example. But this is exactly the complexity that is real for you, that is needed, that is actually not something that you can just negotiate away and say, like, let's just ask for one price. That doesn't make any sense. That's the reality we face, and that's why the tools need to basically replicate the reality of the complexity of these different events, meaning that a more complex solution is needed in order to run the complex events. A rather simple solution is needed in order to run the tail stuff. But I think just this is the reality in the market, and that's not just me saying that, that's actually Gartner also recognizing that. Because if you look at the market guide for sourcing applications, the tech is very much mirroring this kind of difference in complexity. So Gartner is talking about it from the perspective of standard sourcing, which is the standard RFX kind of behavior, then sourcing optimization, which are all of the advanced features around scenario modeling, which we will talk a bit more about now. And then the autonomous sourcing and negotiation part, that is really for the tail spend or like the smaller tactical buys. So if this is the market, if this is the reality that we face in organizations, then let's quickly talk about where do we stand? Where do we actually stand as a function, as procurement, when it comes to sourcing? So I've been doing this now for roughly 15 years, and in my first quarter in procurement, I was introduced to an e-sourcing tool. So therefore that puts me already here on level number 1. And in the last 15 years, I have unfortunately observed that the majority of companies that I engage with are still at level 1. They have bought it potentially, but they might not even be using it. For the exact reason that I mentioned before, that it's not like the tools are not helpful when it comes to mirroring the complexity that we actually see in the market or in the products that we're trying to source. Doesn't matter if it's services or products at that space. But if we think about, like this is borrowed from autonomous driving, this analogy of having these different levels of digitalization. And then really, if you only have a standard RFX capability right now, then you should be able to do level 1, level 2. I know my friend Jacob is here today as well. So he's a very big, he's positioning level 2 extremely strongly and knows how many people are struggling with that. And so what we want to talk about today is actually level 3, because level 4, level 5, that is what Konstantin said we have covered in different webinars already. That's where the autonomous negotiation agents and all of that stuff sits. So that's a reality, but not a lot of people are there yet. And level 3 is basically the forgotten child in some way. And that's why we wanted to bring it back and why we're talking about strategic sourcing. To now slowly come to a conclusion, just why does it matter? Because all of these different technologies allow us to do different things that we couldn't do when we just had pen and paper or Outlook and Excel. That starts with feedback and auctions. As I said, not the topic today, hopefully another day. The agents for sourcing and negotiation, we already covered that in detail. And then the scenario optimization and game theory when it comes to more negotiation design. And those are twins in a certain way, because one enables the other. But what we really want to talk about now is the scenario optimization. So we will jump into that. I will quickly skip over this again. If you have never heard of autonomous sourcing and autonomous negotiation, that's really used for simple stuff. Payment term negotiation, single PO, single supplier PO negotiations, or like tactical sourcing that could be done by the stakeholders, where you usually find then these 2 to 5% in additional savings, which allow you to basically extend your reach into spend that you have previously not been able to cover. So again, plenty of content on that front already available. So let's move on to the actual meat of advanced sourcing. And that is scenario modeling. So I talked about decision modeling or scenario modeling, whatever you want to call it really. But what we mean by that is that we take the complexity drivers that we had earlier and we add to that the business rules and constraints. And that's why I said earlier, it's so important to understand what those are. Because I've been in projects where the development team at one point said, we can only work with this supplier. Or we cannot change the spec of a certain part. Topics like that, those are the constraints that we might actually face, and they can come from, again, multiple different areas. They can come, as I said, from the qualification of a supplier, they can come from the capacity of a supplier, they can just come from emotions, that people just want to work with somebody specifically, and a couple of others. And so that's where these complexity topics like risk, sustainability, supply diversity, all of those elements can come in as well. So they are the rules that define what kind of strategic options we at the end of the day have. And then on the other side, we see these typical sourcing scenarios that people actually apply. What is the lowest cost? What is the lowest risk? What happens if I only award my incumbents? If I want to have the most sustainable solutions, the lowest scope-free emissions, whatever it may be, there's like a vast area of things that you want to optimize for. And where in the past we were simply not able to optimize for that because in Excel it was painful. But this is a very real example of somebody saying, hey, I only want to work with my preferred suppliers. I don't want to have more than 3 of them. Done. That is basically what we call a sourcing scenario, and that we can optimize for when we have a complex bid structure, let's say. So just to make sure that everyone understands what we mean by scenario-based thinking, this is what it is, and this is what Gartner refers to this the sourcing optimization. And basically what it does is it is taking it from the more manual and kind of static environment that we were facing before into something that is more guided, more automated, and also more collaborative, hopefully, going forward. So that we can actually model these award options that we face, and you can actually talk to your stakeholders about, okay, what are the options and what do they mean to the business? And what I found is that there's a lot of money to be saved by thinking in that way, because whenever there's a constraint, as you can imagine, that costs you money. If you say, I can only drive this car, well, then a lot cheaper cars might not be relevant for you. If you only need to travel in a certain class, well, you know there is a cheaper class. And it's the same when it comes to constraints in sourcing decisions, that every constraint has a price tag. And understanding that is really the beauty of this and enables you to usually unlock more savings. And because I've done this now for, I think, roughly 7 years with these advanced tools, I can tell you that I have not yet found a category where it doesn't work. We have done it with large CapEx projects across multiple sites. We have a case study for that later on. We have done it for marketing agency services with rate cards across global agencies for 25 markets. We have done it for facility management across 5 regions. We have done it in packaging. I don't think that there's really any limitation. The unfortunate truth is that most people think about this kind of tooling only when it comes to super complex logistics projects. And I think that is a big miss that I hope none of you will fall into. With that, let me shut up. I hope now everybody gets a good understanding of what sourcing and procurement is and what kind of bandwidth we actually face. And now I think let's bring it back to Oscar. Sorry for having you be quiet here now for some time. But now is really your time to tell us a little bit more about, again, what does augmented strategic sourcing do differently? And build on what Konsti told us why you built it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Fabian. Maybe if we can just go into the next slide very quickly. For a lot of the customers, and whilst today is our official launch of our strategic sourcing product, we've had for quite some time now a few early customers who have really come to us with the problems that they have today in strategic sourcing, and we've collaborated with them on building what we think is really what strategic sourcing looks like or should look like in 2026. And so some of the complexity that we've had to navigate is for the majority of our customers, we are trying to convince them to not use Excel. And whilst we are all aware of the problems with Excel, we also know that Excel is wildly flexible. And so when we're building a new when we're building a new product that is meant to handle the complexity that Excel today can somewhat manage to handle, it has to be flexible by default. And so we spent a lot of time on kind of having the benefits of Excel without having the drawbacks of Excel. So we have very powerful kind of support for multi-dimensional pricing tables and being able to bring in, again, that flexibility that maybe Excel has to offer without some of the issues on formulas breaking or having to share documents or versioning issues or not understanding how something was built last time you did this sourcing event 3 years ago. And that brings me on nicely to collaboration as well. So again, while Excel offers a lot of flexibility, it makes collaboration very tough on sourcing events. So again, as like if we're trying to convince someone to stop using Excel, we have to make a platform that's more collaborative than Excel is. And so allowing users to be working on the same sourcing event at the same time, having it assigned to different teams to fill out their part of the sourcing event was very, very important to us. And then on top of, convincing our customers that we are at least at parity with Microsoft Excel, we have to convince them that there's value add beyond that. And so that's really where we think about how AI can execute the strategic sourcing events, especially on the evaluation side, where it's not only there to help the person to create a sourcing event and validate that the data that the supplier has uploaded is correct and do some initial scoring, but it can actually go and start running these evaluations itself and can become iterative. So we really want, to convince people that we're at least as good as Excel, and then that we can do things that today on Excel is just as impressive as many of the Excel models that I've seen with our customers are, that it just can't be replicated with sourcing solutions today.
And it's quite interesting because, again, as I said, I've been doing this for quite some years, and this discussion around the power of Excel has obviously been there as long as I have been talking about this. Yet, when I go into a lot of companies and I look at the Excel capabilities of certain users, I'm not really sure that they're leveraging the capability and the flexibility of Excel anyway, let alone, and again, I had some consulting projects where we didn't have this kind of tooling and had to have an analyst just to work on the Excel analysis of large tenders. So therefore, it's quite funny that is always one of the big objections or challenges that people get. Yet the reality is probably not as rosy.
Well, that's a very good point. And it's also, when these customers are using, when these sourcing teams are using Excel, even something like an analysis of just comparing, bid sheets versus the last time they conducted that event a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that not only you're trying to analyze now, you're trying to make it dimensional over time. Often that is just too complex. And so a lot of sourcing teams just give up on what would be very valuable information of bringing that historical context on how they've done this in the past. Because again, we're just really forcing the limitations on what an analyst can do with some very fancy formulas and macros.
Yeah, and you're using, I think this is a rather extreme example last year, or a recurring buy. Well, I guess a lot of times that it doesn't exist, but even something as simple as round 1 versus round 2 sometimes becomes extremely painful if you build a super nice looking but shittily constructed Excel file where you cannot just copy paste over and have to basically restart the entire analytics process with each round, and beware that somebody says, let's change something in the structure.
Yeah, exactly. And just making sure the supplier's responses that they actually filled out that Excel, can take weeks literally of just a back and forth of giving that feedback to suppliers that you filled this out wrong. Are you sure that price is correct? Things like that. Just that alone is very manual and is primarily in Excel.
Yeah. And so what's here on the right side on the slide is there for a reason. It's the market guide for sourcing applications that was launched, I think, it says 2nd of March of this year. And you're one of the very, very few providers that are actually named for both the autonomous sourcing as well as the complex stuff. I think,
Yeah,
Konstantin, that is coming back to your point from earlier that you started somewhere and developed into the other extreme now, let's say. Is there anything that you want to share on what that means and why that is relevant to companies?
Yeah. So I think strategic sourcing as a module itself can be sometimes be complete standalone if you wanted to, right? Um, in our case, most of our customers have it integrated into their existing process, but it could be technically standalone. But if you think about it as make progress with AI as the function over the next few years will become more and more autonomous. Essentially, it makes a lot of sense to build it the way that we have done it, right? Coming from the execution angle, where it's like, okay, integration is key, making sure that we can execute as much spend in the most autonomous way possible. And now adding the strategic layer on top, making sure it's also integrated, right? And making sure that this is not, while you could run it standalone, make sure that it's actually integrated in your existing process and that your overall demands are then by that funneled into the right buying channel, including also then an RFX if it might be, right? And yeah, I think for that it makes a lot of sense to construct it this way, right? We are very happy that we took that path. And I think, as you will see in the demo in a few minutes, you can extract enormous value with strategic sourcing.
But I think
and
that's
just maybe very quickly on the Gardener point, I think in a world where companies can, spin up demos and have some very cool features that they can spin up very quickly and show you very impressive features. We're really proud of the fact you can see that's dated the 2nd of March, where the 9th of July, we're officially launching our strategic sourcing tool that Gardener so early on in essentially the initial phases of us, bringing this to market and proving that this works. We're able to recognize those capabilities. So, I mean, I'm very close to the strategic sourcing product, so I'm very proud of this. But that we've really taken our time to make sure it's ready for enterprise.
I think very close is a little bit of an understatement. I would say you're the uh, it's your brainchild. So now tell us what's cool about it. Like, do your sales show.
Yeah, sure. So I'll jump into the screen. I'll jump into a demo very quickly here, but you can see all of the things that are possible. Really, again, a lot of things are around setting up the event and making sure that the event is set up in a way that then when suppliers input data, that data can be validated, can be essentially the system can do initial scoring or initial data validation of everything that's been provided, whether that's pricing components or non-pricing components, really having everything um, in one place. And again, having the system kind of do a draft, almost a first pass of that data validation. And then really building from there of having multi-dimensional pricing with different scenarios, driving round by round evaluations, using those to get feedback or to help you kind of create negotiations with suppliers, down to a really cool feature that I hope I'll have time to show you, given what time it is agentic evaluations, which really allows an agent to essentially dig through all of this data and try to figure out what you might have missed in running those evaluations yourself. So I think, Fabian, if you're happy for me to share.
Yeah, just while I stop sharing, there's one question that came in from Nalini around for companies just starting on their journey to leverage AI and procurement. Many are using internal agents to help building sourcing strategies, getting market data, and it seems to be working good as a step one. Do you agree? Um, what do you think? I can share my perspective afterwards, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great to build internal stuff, right? I think it goes really along also with our thesis. Like you have to build up the knowledge on AI internally. It makes a lot of sense to spend quite a bit of time building internal agents, making sure they work, and so on and so forth. Where a lot of our customers essentially come to kind of to a limit is when it comes to the integration piece, right? Now these you might build these agents on ChatGPT, on Claude, wherever they live, essentially making sure that they can properly and continuously access the systems in order to extract information and then essentially write these information to a new system or back into the original system and so on and so forth. That's essentially where a lot of the complexity lies, and where we just see that a lot of companies, in the end, at the core of the software company, they're, for example, a machining production company, whatever it is, which is at their core and not software and AI. And I think that's where we see a lot of the limitation, but a great way to start to try out internally your own build agents.
Definitely. And I think as also you scale that, it almost becomes the Excel problem of having very powerful models. It works great. And then, if people don't maintain them, or people start building their own versions of those Excel models with different macros and things like that. And so suddenly where organizations start, so great place to start, but when they start needing better governance tools and understanding how these evaluations are done and having some uniformity across sourcing events, then it starts becoming very difficult to track and follow how people are, let's face it, just using Claude, uploading sourcing events, and kind of depending on the prompt, spitting out something that looks plausible, but is very poorly governed and things like that. And so it just becomes almost a very similar prospect to maintaining dozens of different Excel models that are spitting out results that maybe people don't fully understand on how they're being calculated. But I mean, definitely a very strong starting point and a great place to start for more immature procurement organizations.
I'm surprised that you're painting such a positive picture. I'm actually a little bit more concerned around that, because I would say it really depends on what kind of organization are we talking about. I believe there's a size of organization where that is good enough, where up to a certain point that is good enough. But if you are a multinational, multi-billion-dollar company, then I believe, yes, there is room for that. And we know, like, some of the biggest pharma companies, like, they invest a lot into their own AI agents, but they also at the same time buy the products, because not only the governance part, but it's this typical buy versus build problem all over again, that everybody finds it interesting for a moment, invests the next 12 to 24 months into it, but then leaves it alone for just 2 months, and all of a sudden things start to break. And I had a very interesting conversation last year at Procurement with a very, very large tier 2 supplier in Germany for the OEMs. And they said, like, I literally asked, because they said, hey, we build everything our own. And I was like, how often do you need to actually rework, check, make sure it still works and it still gives that output? He says, day 2. So literally, you cannot just leave it alone for even a week with not checking that it's still working. And so therefore I find it, I'm sometimes a little bit more careful, because again, like, it is then usually often also not built by people that are really that deep into the tech or into subject matter in order to guide it. So therefore I would find it, I'm a bit more careful, I would say, on that one. But okay, let's move on.
Yeah.
Now let's go to the augmented strategic sourcing demo. Yeah. Send him a message and learn more about it. It's beautiful, according to his words, and what I see is pretty decent, I would say. I would kiss the baby if I could. But now just one final question that I had for you. Now that we bring agentic AI to strategic sourcing and to strategic procurement, where does that leave the sourcing manager? What is the implication on the sourcing manager as a kind of final question?
They can do so much more. The sourcing manager can do less of the tasks that today take a long time, are very painful, and they add very little value. And they can do way more sourcing events. Procurement is procurement, but it's more fun to do it this way. And it's much more, you generate a lot more value just because of what the manual tasks that you no longer have to do. So I think the future is bright for the sourcing manager.
Yeah, I think to add to this, I think we're not talking about replacement, right? It's really an augmentation, right? And the skills of sourcing managers shift towards more framing the problem, framing the constraints well, and then exercising their experience and judgment on the awarding piece, less on figuring out how this is going to work and look like and calculate on a spreadsheet, right? And I think that's as Oscar said, the future is super bright for sourcing managers. There's so much cool stuff that how can technology can support that process. And I think you can extract enormous value with the right piece of technology.
So I think the fun part is definitely exciting. For once, we just get a little bit more fun into our roles. But I think this augmenting element is also really something that I can just underline. We wanted to share a case study, but we're out of time now. But one of the largest projects I've ever done was a 300 million capex building three new plants, and it would have been impossible to do it without this technology. It's simply impossible because there were so many variables, so many suppliers, so many everything. And from that perspective, I think it's not just the fun, but it's also this feeling of I can cope with that complexity and I can actually turn it into an advantage for myself because all of a sudden I can model these scenarios. I actually can think about 50 more elements that I can talk to that supplier about because I have this much more granular view on where they perform and where they underperform. I think for me it has always been this element of not just fun but also to really make me feel like now I knew what was going on and it made me feel a lot more confident, I would say, in doing these tasks and in having these conversations. So therefore I think that's on my side what I take away from these tools. Cool. So with that, thank you very much for joining us. A quick introduction into AI and sourcing, and welcome to this world, Augmented Strategic Sourcing from Procure AI. If you have any questions, let us know. I know there were a lot more in the chat. I will have a look at those and we will get back to you on that. But yeah, if there's anything that you would like to learn more about, just feel free to reach out and we can tackle it then. Perfect. Have a wonderful evening and yeah, talk soon.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.